Let us go to the first puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position. Knight takes rook. Knight takes rook. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes knight. Pawn takes pawn. Checks in puzzle position are: queen to g8, check. Queen to f6, check. Queen to e5, check. Bishop to b2, check. The best move in puzzle position is bishop to b2, check. Knight to c3. Bishop takes knight, check. Queen takes bishop. Queen takes pawn. Let's see the next puzzle. The threats are: bishop takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. The checks are: bishop takes pawn, check. Solution to the puzzle is: bishop takes pawn, check. Rook takes bishop. Rook takes rook. Bishop to e1. f4. Another one. The threats are: knight takes pawn. Queen takes knight. Queen takes pawn, check. Checks in this position are: queen takes pawn, check. The puzzle is solved using knight to e4. Knight to f3, check. Pawn takes knight. Queen takes queen, check. Knight takes queen. Next puzzle. The threats are: there are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. Answer to this puzzle is e4. Pawn takes pawn. King to e5. King to d3. h4. Let's see the next puzzle. The threats are: there are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. Solution to the puzzle is: king to e6. King to d3. King to f5. King to e3. g6. h3. h5. King to f3. g5. Pawn takes pawn. King takes pawn. h4. King to f5. Let's continue. Threats in puzzle position are: bishop takes pawn, check. Queen takes knight. Bishop takes knight. Here are the checks. Bishop takes pawn, check. The puzzle is solved using bishop to b6. Queen to d5, check. Queen takes queen. Rook takes queen. Rook to e8. Rook takes bishop. Rook takes rook. Let's continue. Here are threats in puzzle position. Pawn takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. Answer to this puzzle is: pawn takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. b3. h5. g5. One more. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Bishop takes pawn. Here are checks in puzzle position. Queen takes pawn, check. The answer is: queen takes pawn, check. King to e7. Bishop to h5. g6. Queen to f6, check. Next puzzle. Here are the threats. Rook takes queen. King takes queen. There are no checks in this position. The best move in puzzle position is: king takes queen. Bishop to d4. Rook to d1. Bishop takes rook. Bishop takes rook. Rook takes bishop. Bishop takes pawn, check. King takes bishop. Rook takes rook. Next puzzle. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes bishop, check. Knight takes pawn. Knight takes bishop. Knight takes pawn. Rook takes bishop. Checks in this position are: queen to e7, check. Queen to d8, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes bishop, check. Rook to c7, check. Answer to this puzzle is: knight to d3. Rook to c8. Knight to e5, check. Queen takes knight. Queen takes queen. Next, puzzle position vulnerabilities are: queen takes knight. Rook takes pawn. Rook takes rook. Rook takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Bishop to h3. Knight to g3. Queen to c6. Pawn takes bishop. Rook takes rook. Let's see the next puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position. Rook takes knight. Knight takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. The puzzle is solved using knight to f6. Bishop to g5. g6. Another one. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are: queen takes knight. There are no checks in this position. Solution to the puzzle is: queen takes knight. Rook takes pawn, check. King to c1. Rook to g6. Rook takes pawn, check. King to g8. Rook takes rook, check. King takes rook. Queen takes queen. Rook takes queen. Rook to e6. Let us go to the next puzzle. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are: queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes knight. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Queen takes pawn, check. Solution to the puzzle is: rook to f2. Queen to h1, check. King to d2. Queen to d5. Knight to c3. Queen takes pawn. Pawn takes queen. Next, threats in this position are: there are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. The puzzle is solved using: king to d4. King to e6. c4. Pawn takes pawn. King takes pawn. King to d6. King to d4. Let's see the next puzzle. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Rook takes rook. There are no checks in this position. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Rook takes rook. Pawn takes rook. a5. King to d5. b5. King takes bishop. Pawn takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. Pawn takes rook. Another one. Here are the threats. Queen takes rook, check. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. The checks are: queen takes rook, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Rook to d8, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Queen takes rook, check. King to g7. Rook to e2. Queen to b1, check. Rook to e1. Another puzzle. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are: queen takes rook. Rook takes pawn. The checks are: queen to f7, check. Queen to f8, check. The puzzle is solved using: rook takes pawn. King takes rook. Queen to f7, check. King to h8. Rook to d2. Rook takes pawn. Queen to f6, check. King to h7. Queen takes rook. Another puzzle. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are: queen takes queen. There are no checks in this position. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Queen takes queen. Bishop takes queen. Knight to f8, check. King to g8. King takes bishop. King takes knight. h5. Let us go to the next puzzle. Threats in this position are: there are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. The best move in puzzle position is: king to f3. King to e6. King to g4. f5, check. King to g5. Next puzzle. Threats in this position are: queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn. The checks are: queen takes pawn, check. Rook to g3, check. Rook to c2, check. Solution to the puzzle is: rook to g3, check. King to c2. Queen to b5. a3. Queen to a4, check. King to b1. Rook to b3, check. Let's see the next puzzle. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Pawn takes knight. Pawn takes knight. Checks in this position are: queen to h6, check. Queen to c2, check. Queen to b1, check. The puzzle is solved using: queen to h3. Knight takes pawn, check. Bishop takes knight. Queen takes bishop. Queen to h6, check. Queen takes queen. Rook takes queen. One more. Threats in this position are: there are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. Answer to this puzzle is: king to g2. Rook to f2, check. King to g3. Queen takes rook, check. Queen takes queen. Let's see the next puzzle. Threats in this position are: queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Rook takes bishop. Rook takes pawn, check. Here are checks in puzzle position. Queen takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn, check. The puzzle is solved using: queen takes pawn. Rook to d8. Queen to c7. One more. Here are threats in puzzle position. Rook takes pawn, check. Bishop takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn. Checks in puzzle position are: rook takes pawn, check. Queen to b4, check. Queen to c3, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen to c1, check. Answer to this puzzle is rook takes pawn, check. King to e1. Queen to b4, check. King to f1. Rook to e7. Bishop to e5. Bishop takes bishop. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.